Hello and welcome to YAGR, your one-stop shop for game reviews. This week we will be reviewing a game called Sudden Strike 4 by Kalypso Media publishers. Overall, as far as we're concerned with this first impressions and our roughly 3 to 4 hours of gameplay time right now, couple missions in, frankly Sudden Strike 4 is okay. I have yet to see anything that makes it significantly stand out as far as an RTS in general, let alone a war RTS, which there are many of. That is something that we here at YAGR are hoping to see the longer we play the game, is something unique about it. We haven't really seen that much that's unique about Sudden Strike 4 compared to other World War II RTSs. In fact, we've seen things that it's missing that other RTSs in general have had for a long time. It's a little concerning to see that they kind of didn't really follow industry standard base requirements for what's expected of a game like this, but maybe that has to do with something we haven't discovered yet. It's the first impressions, we're only a couple hours in. I think it's still got some merit, effectively. One of the main things noted by the playthrough team is that the game actually plays out pretty slowly overall. If you're into RTSs a little bit more along the StarCraft line and things like that, this is actually a fairly slow RTS, and also there's no kind of macro management, at least as of yet, if at all. It's pretty much you're provided these kinds of units, and sometimes you'll get reinforcements, but otherwise it's all about the micro of the units. This is interesting, and can make it a little more accessible to new RTS players in a certain degree. But if that was the goal and target of making it a little bit more focused on micro-based stuff and taking a large portion of an RTS out of the equation, then they kind of made a mistake in that they don't teach good RTS habits effectively. The game doesn't have, as far as I'm aware, any kind of camera lock or camera position save mechanic. The game, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have any kind of camera position saving mechanic, so you can jump between a lot of important locations. It does have control groups, and it very effectively teaches those, and that's important, but things like splitting units, effectively moving them, and also, to a degree, it doesn't necessarily teach a lot of flanking things as well, which is actual military tactics. It gets some of the military stuff right, and I can speak from experience in that regard, such as the importance they emphasize of pairing infantry and armor together because armor doesn't have good sightlines and things like that. And then also using anti-tank against tank, using tank against infantry and tank, things like that. So it gets a lot of the kind of rock, paper, scissors-y elements you get a feel for when you're first starting out in RTS, correct? But it also is very adamant about those things. There's very little you can do if you don't have the right unit to counter the unit they have thrown at you. And that can be extremely limiting when it comes to an RTS like this. An RTS should not feel like a series of attack, counter, counter their counter, while you build to counter their counter that countered you. It's not left, right, left, right, left. It needs to have more depth than that, and right now we're not feeling that here at YAGR from Sudden Strike 4. It's effectively, did I put my counter unit in the right spot to counter their unit? There's no play outside of that, and if you didn't, then you didn't. Full disclosure, we haven't messed around with the online play too much yet, but that's because playing through the single-player campaign is the first thing on the list of things to do for this week of reviewing the game. One thing that Sudden Strike 4 did very well is they made a solid tutorial. It doesn't necessarily teach you all of the things, but playing through the beginning of the campaign, the first one, the German one, if that's the order you're supposed to play it in, the way the menu presents it, it goes through and teaches you some of the other mechanics that the tutorial doesn't in fact go over. The directional shooting is covered in the tutorial, the function of the base units, the tanks, the infantry, and the support units, which are essentially your three classes within the game, are very much clearly covered. But You also have these additional assets like air support units that you don't learn about in the tutorial, you learn about it through the campaign. And then you also have these kind of specialty different kinds of infantry units. You don't just have the riflemen, you have the mortarmen, you have the medics, which it never taught me about how to use medics. Luckily, it's very self-explanatory and easy to understand. So I can understand how they figured you probably don't need to go over that process. And for the most part, a lot of the minor decisions by the AI are automated. But the problem is, it's not necessarily the minor decisions that I need automated by the AI. Friendlies, as long as you have the fire at will function turned on, will typically shoot at enemies when they come across them, and as soon as they come across them. There is supposed to be a type of attack move that you can do, but it doesn't function the same as other RTSs. Basically, from what we can tell is, it takes the conglomerate of units that you have and begins to move them forward, and if they identify an enemy, as soon as the longest ranged element is in range to shoot them, all of your other elements stop and hold position with them, and wait for your 2 long-range elements to hit them while they're all out of range or don't have line of sight. I don't know what made them think that's a good way to do it. I guess it forces you to micro and position your units separately, but there's a lot of very slow, long turn animations for a lot of things, and it makes sense. That's not the issue, but the fact that they're present means that micro is going to be inhibited to a degree. So the fact that that decision to stop moving and hold position with your longest range unit is there means that there's a lot of tinier micromanaging, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except it's compounded by the way you can select units in the game. These are all initial recognition of problems that we've had in the first only 3 to 4 hours of gameplay. So we're desperately hoping that this does not remain the same, but there is potential that it could be that way through the whole game. The reason I say it's compounded by the way you can collect and select your units is you have a couple of the basic features that all RTSs support to do so. You can box units, which is standard. You can select an individual unit, which is standard. But when you go to, typically the command is control click, this game maintains that. When you control click a specific type of unit, it will select all of that type of unit on your screen, absolutely. But it is very specific about that. If you control click a Panzer tank, the only thing you will get are Panzer tanks. You won't get your Tiger tanks, you won't get any other armor elements. It will strictly just be those Panzer tanks. While that's not necessarily an issue for elements like armor and things like that within the game, because normally you're going to want to have a little bit more control and position with those, when you're trying to do infantry movements in the game, and you control click an infantryman, it only selects the same type of ground unit. It'll select only riflemen, when obviously you want to move some medics, maybe a mortarman, some other types of units, infantry and ground units, forward with that. But instead, you'll control click in a tense moment, move all of that one type of unit forward, and then you still have a bunch of dudes standing around in the middle of your tank column, getting blown up by the enemy tanks when you tried to move them out of the way, or your flanking force that you thought you had is all of a sudden a lot less. It's very annoying, and it makes you think through the types of control groups you build. What would be nice is if there were just commands to select all armor, all support, and all foot elements. That'd be very convenient, and especially because the game is designed around those 3 types of units. That would not be an unquestionable or out-of-character request. I think that was something that was looked over. And the thing about all these suggestions that's important to remember, and this goes not only for Sudden Strike 4, but all games that happen to be reviewed on YAGR, is patches are very common in games. So if they want to make these changes, they absolutely can. And it's our job as the player base to voice those opinions, make them heard, and ask them to make these changes, because they're very much implementable. So basically, the only way we've discovered to work around this kind of frustration is to be very, very careful and methodical in making your control groups. Luckily, there is a pause function within the game that allows you to stop everything on the screen, go through and build those things. You can even issue commands, but there's no lasting indication of the command that you've issued if the game is paused. So you can lose track of where you've told things to go, or what vehicles you've already unloaded, and things like that. Another serious complaint about the gameplay, and this again has to do with quality of life for controlling your units, is it's important to be able to use effectively what's referenced as troop transport units. Because, as you can see, foot soldiers move a lot slower than many of the other units. If you have them selected with other units, then they will move as slow as the slowest unit, most of the time. But that's not always the case, and also it can severely slow down your gameplay even more in an already, albeit realistic, but slow process for conducting the game. The point I'm trying to make is there's no way to quick unload people. You have to select the individual vehicles or all of the same type of vehicle, click the unload button, then you have to select all of those troops that were unloaded from those vehicles through either very careful and meticulous boxing or pausing and resetting a control group, and then move them out of your vehicle formation to the position that you want them to. It's a very long, arduous process, and because you can't see any representation of making commands in a pause menu, it's kind of messy, and you can spend more time than you need to without actually playing the game. Every time you pause it, it feels like you're trying to go into a planning phase, but there's no support for the planning phase. It's literally just a pause screen, and you try to remember what you tell your units to do. It's a little annoying. It'd be nice if you could set specific formations or build auto tactics that are conducted. That would be pretty effective. Things like that. Those are some of our initial gripes with the game, but there are a few things that Sudden Strike does pretty well that I haven't seen particularly common in RTS games or otherwise. Particularly, one of the things that struck our eye here at YAGR is the ability to select a group of units and then hold your movement button and basically kind of adjust the formation that they will result in and control the angle in which they're facing, which is obviously very important in a game like this that attempts to be as realistic as possible, especially when you have elements like tanks that take a while to turn, or infantry that only have limited sight based on where they're looking, etc., etc. So I thought that kind of level of control of moving an element, positioning it, and having that extra control of position was helpful and impressive, and I hadn't really seen it done too much before. I'm sure there's other games that have done it or something like it, but it was executed pretty well in Sudden Strike 4. It's one of the things it did well. Another thing it did well is the maps look graphically appealing. It's hard to make things look interesting from this far away from where the action is happening. And they did a nice crisp job. The colors look believable, the terrain looks believable, things like that. And also the sound effects are very nice too. The tanks sound like they're tanks, the infantry sounds like they're infantry. They even respond differently if they're in a stealth situation, such as hiding in tall grass, etc. One of the things that I wish they had gone further with, though, was the importance of terrain and your ability as the player to recognize and analyze this terrain. You can recognize it by looking at the map that you're on a hill or there's a ridge somewhere, and this would provide good line of fire and things like that. But what would have been really impressive and a cool extra step is if they had a tactical view. And that would come back to the point I made before of when you pause the game and give orders, having representation of what orders you've given, maybe add a little bit more customization to what you can tell them to do upon reaching the location, instead of just get there and then figure it out when you get there. Have a tactical view that not only lets you do those things, but also provides you with a terrain map that tells you kind of the general slope and the types of terrain using accurate military representation. I think that would have taken this game to a whole new level if they added that. It would have been quite a bit of extra work, I'm sure, but it would have been extremely impressive, and the game absolutely could have done it. But, that being said, the way it's presented now is solid. Everything is pretty clear and crisp, and it's obvious what's happening on your screen and when things are happening off of your screen. There's always an audio cue as well as a cue on your minimap. One of the other frustrations with the way the game is presented that I have, though, is you can't zoom out further than you currently see right now. A lot of times I'd like to zoom out further, maybe watch 2 battles unfold at once, things like that, and I'm sure to a degree that is done a certain way because of multiplayer and online play. But from that regard, as long as both players can do that, then it would have been fair, and I think it would have provided a kind of more impressive, overwhelming sense of what is actually happening in the battle taking place on your screen. It's still pretty exciting to see when shells come in and bodies go flying and you hear the responses of the soldiers and the thuds of the rounds, things like that. But I'd like to see more of it at once. I'm very much about the information overload that a game can provide, and frankly, there just isn't that much of it on the screen at any time. You tell a unit to go somewhere, they're going to shoot stuff when they get there and on the way, and that's pretty much the control you have. There's a couple special commands like having people pop out of tanks to increase tank field of view, throw grenades, tow a certain other thing, and then you have your support units that can go refuel and re-ammo and etc, etc. But overall, it's not very complex mechanically. It's pretty much move and shoot, which, albeit may be a reasonably accurate representation to a degree, when you make a game that you want to be impressive and make you feel like you're an actual general or commander on a battlefield doing all these things, putting that extra level of detail is going to take your game to the next level, and that's what kind of feels like is missing from Sudden Strike 4 right now. I'm hoping that that changes as we go through the game more intently this week and take a little bit closer look at a lot of these different things. But right now, Sudden Strike 4 is an okay run-of-the-mill RTS World War shooter, basically. There's not a lot that it does uniquely, there's plenty that it does well, and there's a significant portion of it that could have been more completely thought through and wasn't. So, right now, our opinion of this is pretty widespread. I think if you're new to RTS and want to take a look at it, this might be a decent game to go check out. If you're a die-hard RTS or World War game fan, this might not be the game for you right now, because it doesn't have the level of detail that some other games out there have. So that's a bit concerning. That's our first impressions here at YAGR of Sudden Strike 4 by Kalypso Media. We hope deeply that we are more impressed the longer we play the game, but right now I would say Sudden Strike 4 is your run-of-the-mill World War II RTS. We'll see how it develops throughout the week. Please come back on Wednesday for our deep dive, and most certainly come back on Friday for our final verdict, to see if any of these opinions have changed and what might have been discovered that makes up for its shortcomings. This has been the YAGR team. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you online soon.